Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Today, I'm going to talk about real men. I've been talking about men and abandoning their responsibilities, abandoning their families, shirking their duties. So, today I'd like to talk a few minutes about real men, and I think some of it will apply to women, but I'll perhaps take that up at another time. Human nature hasn't changed. Values have changed. Some cultural situations have changed. But I think what we'll find is we have innate characteristics in the men, just as we do in the women, which really gives support to the idea that boys will be boys and girls will be girls. It's a biogenetic cultural mixture, to be sure. It's not something really simple, but let's talk about some general principles about maleness, masculinity, and manliness. A man who knows he's a man doesn't have to prove it. Now, think about that a minute. Most of the difficulties that you perhaps have seen, at least I have, and I've been involved in a lot of people for many years, somebody feels ashamed or inadequate, backed in the corner, and they start doing things. They start trying to prove something. Either drive the fastest, cuss the loudest, or drink the most, or something like that. What are they really doing? They're trying to prove something. The person who does that sort of thing usually doesn't feel quite adequate, doesn't quite feel a man. Let's just talk about the men today. A lot of harm has come to society through that sort of thing, but also some good has come out of it. There are people who, trying to compensate for their feelings, do accomplish certain goods and do better than perhaps they would otherwise. The aggressiveness, the show-offs, the blowhards, those are the people who run around with a chip on their shoulder. These are the people who also are very likely to abandon the family, not be responsible members. You know, a man who knows he's a man doesn't have to prove it, and he doesn't have to provoke somebody else. The guy who has doubts about himself is usually the one who tries to provoke the doubts, same kind, in other people. And if you want somebody to become dangerous, do that. I say that from experience. I watched a lot of fights start. I used to be a bouncer when I was in college for a short time. I earned a little bit of my money bouncing. And I learned a little bit about people, and if you want somebody to really get to be dangerous, just keep trying to prove the guy's inadequate. Make him ashamed. I also was in charge of admissions for a large mental hospital, and we never had to fight. On 50,000 admissions that I recall by actual count to mental hospitals, and they usually brought the people to us when they were too rough or too disorderly to be kept some other place. We never had anybody hurt. But the rule of thumb is we followed certain rules. One of them was, don't make anybody feel ashamed. Don't make anybody feel inadequate. Relate to the person one-to-one directly. So we'd take ankle bracelets and leg irons and lock belts and handcuffs. We'd take all that sort of stuff off of the people when they would arrive. And just didn't really have any problem with it. But that's how we did it. We focused on that. If you want somebody to be peaceful and kind and stop fighting, compliment them. Make it honest. Now, talking about these men, what does a man really need? You know, this hasn't changed since Adam and Eve. What does man really need? He needs to feel he's good at something. He needs to feel he's master of something. He needs a philosophy of life, philosophy of being. He needs recognition, self-esteem, new experiences, and intimate relationship. And think about those. A person will go to any length to satisfy those needs. Throughout history, any culture, any society you want to study, that's what a man will do. a man is going to try to fulfill those needs. Now, which one is most important? Which one is he going to try to fulfill? The one he has least of at the moment. There's no magic in which one is most important, because as soon as, for example, I may have recognition, then my need for recognition is not as important. Another need takes its place. It's a constantly changing pattern. Let's talk about each one of these briefly. Mastery, pride is what one does. You need to feel good at something, whether you're an artisan, a professional, a craftsman, a laborer. If a man can feel good about what he's doing, that he's good at it, he's going to be easy to get along with. He's going to be much better and able to help other people. He's going to feel more resourceful, responsible. He needs to feel that. You know, I like to watch a master craftsman. I like to watch a good auto mechanic who knows what he's doing. I like to watch a good painter, a ballet dancer. I like to listen to the master performers in music. I like to watch people who really know their trade. For example, there's a guy that works on cars down here in Plattsburgh, in the alignment business. He is a master craftsman. He has no wasted motion. It's a pleasure to watch him. Talking about the product, you know, we have to have pride in the product that we produce. You judge a tree by its fruits, judge a man by what he does. Same old idea. If we look around, we see that the products today, a lot of things in our society, are built just to last till the warranty expires. We know that. There's built-in obsolescence. We're pushing for quantity so often and not quality. Some of you older people remember when you took a car for repairs, and they said, we don't repair them anymore, we just replace the parts. It's hard to find anybody today because it's cheaper to replace it. Hard to find somebody who really knows how to repair some of these things that we have, that we take for granted. We have generational differences, some big generational differences. For example, people my age, people in the 70s. Now, when was the date of our grandparents' birth? My grandparents were born about the time of the Civil War. That sounds strange. Now, when were their grandparents born? About the time of the Revolutionary War, War of 1812. We go back 3 sets of grandparents. You know, my grandparents and their grandparents and their grandparents. Doesn't take much, does it, to get back to some pretty early times. And here's the reason we're going back. Because people in those times had to be resourceful, they had to be independent, they had to be responsible for themselves, and most of the time they had to be responsible for each other. I work with a lot of people preparing to be married, and I hear these kids talk about 50-50 marriages. That comes up so often. And I try to stress on them, no, it is not a good idea. That's not a good idea to go into marriage expecting it to be 50-50. You have to be willing to be 100% responsible. 100, not 50%. 100% responsible. Indeed, the time may come for some of them when that's exactly what happens. And the people who are just willing to be 50-50, what happens to them? They break up, they run, they take to the high country as quickly as they possibly. They can't stand the strain, the stresses. You know, we've had a lot of significant changes in society. Think about these. Changes in society, not the socioeconomics. In other words, it's not so much how much money people had. In previous generations, being poor was not a shameful state. Being willing to stay poor was. Being uneducated was not a disgrace. being unwilling to learn was. Change in values. Being conscientious, fair, honest, a hard worker, these were better qualities of people regardless of their social status. If you found somebody who wasn't any of these things, it didn't matter if they were born with riches or born in poverty. There's a lot of difference between being poor and not having money. I know a lot of people who don't have money who are rich. They're rich because they have values. They're rich because they believe in something. They're rich because they have integrity. They can go to bed and sleep at night with a clear conscience. Those people are rich. Some of them are very poor. I became so very much impressed with that type of thing in the Depression. Yeah, the Depression. You know, that thing you heard about in history way back in the late 20s and early 30s. It continued until 1939. I learned about it also in Mexico and traveling around and visiting families that maybe all they had to live under was cactus plants tied together at the top. But I found in some of those families no possessions, but a lot of pride in their families. It impressed me. People with integrity. A real man has a belief system. I said that was another one of the needs. He has a philosophy of being. I'm not suggesting that a man has to know what philosophy is or even how to spell it. But a real man has a belief system. He believes in something. Typically himself. That he's capable of doing something to take care of himself and those for whom he's responsible. He has standards to live by. And he'll live by them because it's important. He's not afraid to share the standards. He's not afraid to try to explain it. You know, this is what we do. And sometimes he may be backed in the corner and say, well, that's just the way it is. He may not have words to put it together, but he has a feeling. I'd much rather see that than to see somebody who can throw out a bunch of words and not live up to them. Not live up to taking care of responsibility. These belief systems of a real man are fair wages, honest wages, integrity, justice. Yes, and even a belief in a higher power, a God, if you will. A real man seeks recognition. He needs it. He knows he needs it. He likes to be complimented for work well done. He doesn't want to be complimented when it's shoddy. The flattery, these hollow praises. That won't work. Need for recognition is in proportion to what we're really doing. Let's talk about self-esteem a moment. You know, there's a lot of focus today in schools about helping children attain self-esteem, reach self-esteem. I've looked at that with mixed feelings. I've been in the mental health field since 1949, full-time. And I've looked at a lot of these school programs focusing on self-esteem for youngsters. And I'm puzzled because I've seen a lot of philosophers who like to sit around and gaze at their navel. Well, the navel's already served its purpose. No point in gazing at it any longer. This is what I see in schools. Teaching kids to focus on themselves so often without relating it to production, without relating it to competency, without relating it to actually doing something to be proud of. Self-esteem is a belief in one's own value. It's valuing oneself. Well, we have an intrinsic value, to be sure. Yes, simply because we're human beings, we have value. In addition to that, though, we must do something with this human being. You know, the parable of the talents. We can't just bury it and expect it to produce much. No, we have to do something. Pride in accomplishments, pride in good grades, pride in making fastest whatever, the most. Certainly, for accomplishments. Most often, pride in having done one's best. That'll contribute a great deal to self-esteem. I may not win, but if I've done my best, I'm quite satisfied with that. If I know that I've done my best, and I was willing to try to prepare myself for the race, so to speak, whatever the race is. Just like in family life, if I'm willing to try to become the best father that I know how to be, in truth, I may turn out not to be the best one. But if I was willing to try, that's what's going to count. You know, all of us are going to fall down. We'll fall, something we set out to do, but it's not whether or not we fall that's so important. It's how we get up that counts. How we get up and we're willing to try it again. To look at it, well, we shouldn't have stepped that way. This is a better way. Let's try it again. Let's do it the better way. The fundamental ingredient. You know, we try to teach self-esteem. Children learn most often what self-esteem is by observing parents who have it, who model it. If I accept myself as a worthy person, I'll feel that, I'll share it. I don't have to say it, but the way I act. The parent who accepts self that way, as a worthy person, feels adequate. You don't have to have all the answers, that's not important. I never met anybody who has all the answers. All different times in my life I thought I had all the answers, but it turned out to be sort of off base. I haven't found all the answers for anything, but I'm much more comfortable with people who simply keep looking. You know, that's another ingredient of a real man. He has curiosity. He needs new experiences. He keeps wanting to learn from things. He may look at simple things and enjoy it, watch it. He may want to take it apart. Watch how children learn. The very small child comes equipped with a curiosity and keeps learning. And we know, now that I am a member of the geriatric age group, I studied gerontology and taught gerontology for quite a few years. Beginning in 1955, I became a gerontologist. We find that old people who keep an interest in life and who keep going that way, they're the ones who maintain themselves, who stay healthy. You know, a man needs also an intimate relationship, a relationship in which he can feel genuinely accepted, very much like with his own parents. And the parents who feel genuinely accepted can radiate that to children. They can teach it, they can model it. Our genuine acceptance starts with this higher power. I'm not afraid to say that our genuine acceptance starts with God. We are worthy beings because of God. And when we accept ourselves on that basis, we're not inferior to anybody else. We're not superior to anybody else. This genuine acceptance is accepting our own need for relationships with others. You know, by itself, this pencil pen is neither short nor long. It has to be compared to something. We find our social identities in relationships, don't we? Not by ourselves. We're not an island. The person who thinks he can be an island by himself tends to build walls, keeps himself in as well as others out. He's afraid of them. Now what we need men who are willing to shoulder responsibility. It's there, the responsibilities are there, they need to be picked up and taken care of. No man should walk away from his family. No man. The family may not be a legal family. If somebody thinks he's big enough and old enough to go out and have sex, he ought to be willing to take care of the responsibilities that that's going to involve. He shouldn't get married unless he's willing to do that. And he shouldn't have sex unless he's willing to take care of the product, the produce of that encounter or encounters. Simple, old-fashioned. Yes, that's what we need. We need men. If we have good men, we're going to find that the women will certainly come along, but I'll talk about the women another time. And until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good day, men. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton, and this is Family Life in the North Country. Let's start off with a question and discussion. It starts off with, how has marriage changed in modern society? You know, we're always hearing and talking about marriages. Basically, marriage has changed because, or rather, in a way that it's getting together is different. It used to be, as you probably know from history, that the parents arranged the marriage. And that's still done in some societies in the world. But people were married, so to speak, to benefit the families, to preserve or to increase their wealth, to preserve or try to improve on their gene pool, you know, like a good family line, and to help protect them. You know, kingdoms and principalities were put together sometimes through marriage so that they could have mutual defense or solve wars or something like that. And love was never a real factor. Young people were told who they would marry, and then love would come out of it sometime later. But if you think about it, that's what made it also easy for some people to just to have families, just to have a marriage, and then they had their courtships outside of their marriage. But with the Christian era, the time Christ came into being and marriage was recognized and sacramentalized, the Christian times then gave individual responsibility. People had freedom of choice. Given freedom of choice, that's one of the teachings of God. He gives us a choice as to what we do or don't do, and we reap the benefits or pay the penalties accordingly. But with individual responsibility and accountability, then people enter marriage for quite different reasons than they used to. The idea doesn't seem to really improve on marriage a whole lot. It's interesting. I don't have any really good evidence that marriages in countries where the parents arranged marriages are worse off than people in this country where they make their own. Nuclear family still prevails, that is, two adults of opposite sex living in a socially acceptable relationship, a socially recognized relationship with their own or adopted children. That seems to be consistent all over the world. We also have consistency in that basically wherever you find marriage, where in any society, marriages were supposed to last and they were supposed to produce children. Those are called near universals in anthropology. That is, they're found so consistently that it's taken for granted. Marriages also assume that there would be different roles. For example, mothers were the primary feeders. That sounds strange. Well, most people recognize and remember that other than cosmetic purposes, mothers nursed babies, breastfeeding. Before the days of refrigeration, well, you think babies got the milk. Before the days of artificial products. So mothers had a very specific role. They were the feeders. The fathers, the husbands, were the providers and protectors, primarily because the mother was more homebound and had to be. Well, moving right along, even though marriage roles have changed in a large sense, in terms of what the parents do, have the needs of children changed? Do children need different things today than they used to? And I think the answer has to be no. The children have the same needs. And what do they need? They need somebody to teach them how to become adults in society. Children have that need. They always have. They always will. Somebody has to be present to teach them how to be adults. I say somebody. Preferably two parents. preferably with a family, preferably with a community that supports the same values. To reinforce, to instill in the children what values are important. We have a society today that seems to be running down the road saying, well, whatever values anybody wants. Well, that's not getting it. That's not doing a good job. We have to have consistency, dependability, and the same old three magic words about rearing children seem to prevail. Firm, consistent kindness. You have those in the family, chances are children are going to be all right. I used to listen to students come back from practice teaching. I was never involved directly in the educational programs of colleges, but I taught students who were. And I used to hear them talk about and brag about what they did and how they helped families and how they helped children. And too often, what they were doing was being divisive to families, it seemed to me, because they tried to take the places of parents. Teachers sometimes try to show that they have better ideas than the families, they have better ideas than the parents, and by implication they're telling the children, the students, that the parents are wrong. That's not a very good thing to have. Well, here's another one. It says, recently you talked about real men. What about real women? Well, I'm wondering if I'm man enough to say what I really believe. Maybe hometown cable will cut my salary in half, or who knows, they might even double it. It comes out to be the same. I think it is important to recognize what a real man is and what a real woman is. A real woman will recognize her own worthiness. She will assume personal responsibility for herself and personal responsibility for her children. She will prepare herself for the roles. The roles, it's her choice. But her choice, whatever it's going to be, if she decides to marry and have children, then she's going to be the very best she can at that. If in marriage she needs to prepare herself how to be a wife. A real woman knows her own adequacy. She doesn't have to prove it by excessive dressing or manners. She can do whatever she wants, and she can pretty well wear what she wants. Being woman is also being feminine, simply by definition. And you can see it. You can see that a woman who really feels comfortable with herself can be feminine, whatever she is doing and wherever she is and whatever she's wearing. I've observed that so often over the years. Seen women doing farm work or ranch work or factory work or whatever, and see them being feminine. That doesn't mean flirtatious. That doesn't mean being anything particularly like that. The real woman doesn't have to sell herself. She's not selling herself for a title or a dollar. Basically, she has the same personal needs as a man. Now let's look at that. Personal needs are the same as a man. What do I mean by that? I mean that she has a need for mastery, self-esteem, recognition, an intimate relationship, new experiences, a philosophy of being. We look at these things and we think, yeah, that sounds all right. But the needs of women, the needs of men are not met the same way. And anybody who thinks they are, well, I don't think they're paying attention. A real woman will provide and protect the family. She'll also do it in a different way that benefits the children, will benefit the family. They are different. Women and men come in different packages. We know that, of course we do. But there are some people, and some highly educated people, who get around teaching and trying to teach that there are no differences between men and women. And whatever differences there are, we have to teach against them. That just doesn't make any sense to me. It never has. Chances are it never will. You know, women and men respond differently. It's their hormonal makeup. It's their biological difference. It's not something they've chosen how to do. Some things they choose, yes indeed. Society teaches some people how to be different. I don't quarrel with that. Men are socialized from childhood. Boys are treated differently than girls. I don't quarrel with that. But I say it's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing for boys to be treated differently than girls. What's wrong with that? They are different. So much for that. I think a real woman is quite a happy person. She has the capacity to think, to believe, to work, to really feel comfortable in what she's doing. Same as a real man. Here's another question that came in. It says, one time you spoke of enjoying watching a master work. I recall the master work. I said, I'd like to see somebody who's a technician, who really knows his job, or an artist, or a teacher, or a musician, a dancer, whatever. I really do. I enjoy watching a master work. But the person who posed the question also asked, what about people in teaching? And I think that is something too that's very valuable. I enjoy watching a good teacher. I'm thinking of master teachers, people who seem to grasp how to relate in a very meaningful way to others. It reminds me of the story of the Master's Touch, perhaps some of you recall. The Master's Touch, a story about an old fiddle, an old violin that was found in an attic, and this auction was going on, and the auctioneer picked up this old fiddle, dusty, and held it up and asked what was he bid for it. He got a $5 bid and decided, well, to put it aside, come back to it later. And in the interim, an old man walked up, picked up the violin, dusted it off, tuned it, dusted the bow, and then started playing. The old fiddle turned out to be a beautiful violin because it made beautiful music, and the man played a beautiful song. And then the auctioneer said, what am I bid? And the bid started off at $1,000. It was the same old fiddle, same violin, but the master's touch had made the difference. This is the point. I think that any one of us, not just professionals, not just people who are trained, not just those who are ordained, not people who have a special role, but I think any one of us can be the master's touch with another person. I know I've seen it many times, and I've seen it with people who weren't particularly educated. Maybe they couldn't even spell the word education, but they could see the value and the worthiness in a child. Can help that child become better than he would have been. I think all of us probably can think and recall seeing people like that. Somebody who seemed to have the right touch, the right way of relating, could be an influence. Not necessarily by any particular words, magic words or something like that, but any one of us can really do that. So if we are interested, if we care enough, we can do something like that old man to pick up that old dusty fiddle and brush it off and make music. If we care enough, we can do that with other people's lives. We can dust them off, we can help them a little bit. We can get them going in a way that they're better off. They are better off for having been around us because what? We care. We care enough. And I think the basic ingredient is that when we care that way, we are saying to the youngster, I love you. But it doesn't have to be a youngster. It could be somebody else. I think, though, the person who loves can share that. And I think that's what the Master's touch is. Next time you think about it, so often people say, well, I'd like to help, but I don't know how. You know, I sometimes tell people that who come to me as a professional. I'd like to help, but I don't know how. But you probably know how I can help. I ask the person. And most of the time, just my willingness and wanting to be helpful starts things rolling in the right direction. Probably work for you. Try it. And perhaps you've already done it many times. But do it again. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. I want to start off today because somebody brought to me and showed me an article, and I get the magazine myself, but it was in the American Legion magazine. Perhaps some of you saw it, and I hadn't read it before then, and the American Legion magazine was featuring an article about parents taking care of the children, and some parents being fined and even jailed for the misdeeds of the child. And the person who brought that was posing the question, well, what do you think about people being jailed for crimes they didn't commit? And it has some interesting ramifications. I heard about this on other news programs also, and read about them, and it reminded me, can you believe, 50 years ago, I was on the Wichita Falls County Juvenile Board, Wichita County Juvenile Board, Wichita Falls, Texas. And at that time, we started really considering some of the juvenile delinquents. We asked the court to bring the parents in. The Juvenile Board itself was an advisory board. It didn't have any particular authority of its own. It had the authority of ideas, but we could ask the court, the juvenile court, which is basically in New York, equivalent to the family court. We could ask them to work for us and to do certain things. And what we did, we brought the families in, and we set up a program where the families had to work with their children, basically to have restitution, to make restitution for the delinquent acts. In other words, if their children broke something, then it wasn't sufficient just for the parents to pay a fine. We set up a program, and it worked very well, where the parents had to work with the child to remake or to replace it, and had to go to the trouble, whatever it was, to replace what was broken. And I've seen some good relationships develop in that. Because we required it, the parents to work with the children, sometimes that was the first time the children and parents had really been together on projects. I remember one time in a rural situation in another county, Bastrop County, Texas, where, well, one Sunday morning a group of boys went around and they just basically vandalized. They tore up mailboxes, they tore up signs and at roadways saying who lived here and different things like that. Because they involved mailboxes, that's a federal offense. The postal inspectors wanted to levy a big fine, and even there was one youngster who was 18, and so was tried to be tried as an adult. But it finally prevailed on them not to follow that, but to just delay it. Convinced them that they could always go to court. But let's try it the other way. Let's try to get the parents of these boys to go out there and work and build back things, to replace those mailboxes, to remake the signs, things like that. Because it was just a quick one Sunday morning work of vandalism. They agreed to go along with it, and it was very heartwarming. The afternoons to come by and to see a father and a son working beside the road doing something, rebuilding something that had been broken. I think in that spirit, this thing in the American Legion magazine, in that spirit it could work well. There is a danger, however, and I'm certainly aware of it, because in dealing with juvenile delinquents, and then they become delinquent adults, too often, I know there are some where the parents have not done anything wrong. The parents have done everything they know how to do, and yet the child will deliberately do things to get the parent in trouble. I know that happens as well. I've seen it, and sometimes that's because of other conditions, other circumstances, other than how the child was reared. I'm well aware that there are some social workers and psychologists and people like that who think that whatever the child does is because of the way the child was reared. Well, I don't quite go along with that. I think every now and then there can be a bad seed, that there can be a bad one in the brood. There can be a bad apple in the bunch. I've seen it. I've studied it so thoroughly sometimes with people trying to figure out what in the world could these parents have done to make a difference. And I had to admit sometimes that I couldn't find anything anywhere where parents had done anything wrong. And I had found that they did everything that anybody else would have done. And still, the child grew up to be a criminal, an antisocial person. And that convinced me that there is indeed such thing as a bad seed. Of course, I'm well aware that some of you know what used to be called psychopathic personality. Constitutional psychopathic inferiority, or the modern terminology is sociopathic personality and a social type. Things like that happen. That is a reality. Well, here's another question, a little bit in the same way. Question, what do you think about the idea that it takes a community to rear a child? I think the First Lady has written a book, something of that title, hasn't it? I presume that's where the question comes from, but I haven't read the book. I think the idea of a community that supports a child, supports the families, and has the same values as the family, I think that's very healthy for a child. I think indeed, if a community represents the same value as the family, the child is going to be much better off and see the consistent pattern in learning. That's what used to be in school. I've mentioned on this program before, school boards used to be selected on the basis that the school board members represented community values. So the school board would hire teachers who represented the community values. And so the teachers were teaching the same values as the community, and the community represented the families. So it was all consistent. Nowadays, schools aren't even permitted or allowed to ask what values teachers have. Well, when you get into this community idea, every now and then, of course, there can be a real difference. Say the youngster whose values and family don't represent the community, it can be very bad. For the child, it doesn't necessarily mean that any family's values are acceptable. No, there are problems there. Well, here's another question. Question in sort of the same way. Why do kids commit crimes? What is this thing about juvenile delinquency? You know, I studied that. I mentioned 50 years ago I served on a juvenile board in Wichita County, Texas. And I was very much puzzled why children, primarily boys, from well-off families would steal. That didn't make any sense to me. I grew up in a family that was extremely poor. We didn't steal. The kids, our peers, they didn't steal. And yet these kids who had everything, some of them would get in trouble. Certainly not the majority, but a few of them. And we had a situation there at the time where a gang of relatively well-off teenage boys, too young to go in service. They were sort of between growing up and not, and being a youngster, some of them get into trouble. Well, anyway, I came up with some reasons that people steal for the same reasons that kids do, same reason adults do, try to satisfy a need. And those basic needs are the same for anybody. For example, some people get into difficulty and commit crimes for recognition. They have to talk about it. Just to commit a crime and nobody knows about it, maybe that wouldn't satisfy that need at all. Some commit crimes to show that they're good at something, to be good at something, to know that they can be a master of something. Pick a lock or steal something. Be a shoplifter when all sorts of things are detecting devices are out there to catch people and they try to outsmart it. Same kind of things. A new experience. Sometimes to do something different. Interestingly, the philosophy of being, they want to play the system. It's their belief that they can play the system and make the system pay for their behavior. An intimate relationship. Sometimes sex crimes are committed for that, but most of the time they're not. But it's the absence of intimate relationship that sometimes leads to criminal behavior, where there is perversion or distortion, disturbance of some basic values. Sometimes crimes are to try to treat the self-esteem of a person, to try to get them to feel good about something. Wrong things, but for the individual it may be something where there has been an acquisition, acquire things, even if it means in a criminal way, in an illegal way. They may feel better about driving a car or having property. They feel better about it in that sense. And I found in my pursuits beginning, I was studying a little bit before 50 years ago, but I found that human nature hasn't changed. That people acted out in antiquity and old days of history, even prehistory as far as we can determine the best we can, pretty much the same reasons they do now, for these same basic needs. And what the needs are, the greatest one is whatever the person has least of at the moment. I found that also some people commit crimes because they can get away with it. It's a business, it's like a profession, it's a job for some people. Oftentimes the petty criminal is something that's how he supports himself. He just goes along committing this petty theft, like breaking into houses or stealing things, as a way of life. And in other words, he's supporting himself. Raises a question about, are we too soft on criminals? Of course. Do I think that we have a need for a better system? And do I have ideas about a better system? I don't know. I know the system we have isn't working. I'd like to share some quick information from Dr. John DeLilio, who's a very prominent, knowledgeable person, and in this field. And he says in his research, and he's a specialist who gives evidence and testimony and writes about these things all the time. He's very much involved with it. He says just violent crimes, not counting crimes about property and drugs, just violent crimes, cost society, our society, $400 billion a year. And all of the criminal justice system put together, which includes the enforcement, the courts, everything involved in our society, we spend about $100 billion a year. So we're spending about a fourth of what just violent crimes cost. We look at some more of these figures that he comes up with, and I think they're disturbing, and I want to share them with you. He said there are today more convicted adult violent offenders doing time on the street without any real supervision than are in prison. In other words, there are more people on the street. 1/3 of all the adult violent criminals are now committed by known offenders out on probation or parole or pretrial releases. In state courts, 1/2 of all of the offenders convicted of a single violent crime, and 1/4 of those who are convicted of 3 or more violent crimes are not even sentenced to go to prison. See why crime starts paying people? The median, you know what a median is? That's the middle number. It's not an average necessarily, but it's the middle figure. The median number of crimes, excluding drugs, committed each year by convicted felons is 12, according to very detailed research. Most drug criminals, 98% of them, have a long history of other crimes, not just possession. People are talking about, well, we need to decriminalize drugs so that we don't clutter up the courts with people who just are possessing some drugs. That's not the true situation. According to this research, 98% of the drug offenders have a long history of other criminal behavior. Now, here in the North Country, where prison system is a big business, it doesn't seem to be big enough, does it? Because, just think about it. If 1/3 of all of the people who are criminal violators and of violent crimes are not even sentenced to prison, and most of those who are, it gets to be a very serious problem. I wish I had a good answer. A good answer, as far as I know, is really carry out the law the way it is. Quit playing favorites. Look at drugs, what they really are. The drugs are usually a stepping stone to criminal violent behavior. And don't give me that stuff about, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. I know so-and-so and how many people smoke pot. Well, maybe I do too. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good day. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. And this is sort of a carryover of a discussion I was having with someone about roles, social roles. A person was asking me, you mentioned roles or use the word a number of times, and I do, because I often talk about roles in marriage and roles in family. That is, what is the expected behavior of a husband, of a wife, of a child? That's what a definition of a role is. Definition of role is a set of expected behaviors. So keep that in mind, and I'll mention some of these things about it. When somebody acts out of a role, we certainly notice it. We notice it quickly. For example, a 2-year-old's not supposed to act like a 12-year-old. 12-year-old's not supposed to act like a 2-year-old. Very more commonly today, we see 12-year-olds acting like 18-year-olds, don't we? So there are all sorts of roles. A mother's supposed to be a mother. What does that mean? That means we have a set of expected behaviors that we think mothers ought to carry out. Same thing about fathers. And the same thing about children. Excuse me. I think it would be helpful, because so often individuals get caught up in thinking, well, there's something wrong with me if I'm not doing well. People who reach out for others, want to help, want to receive help from others, oftentimes what the problem is not a problem with the person, maybe a problem with the role, what the person's being expected to do. Let's review quickly why some people can't carry out a role, can't do the expected set of behaviors, can't play the role. For example, there may be an impaired role. I may not be physically able. I may not have the talents or the smarts to do what I'm expected to do. There are a number of roles that by themselves are impaired. How about being sick or bedridden? You know what the role of a sick person is in a hospital? Of course, think about it. All of you have been in a hospital. You go to a hospital, and what's the first thing you ask the person lying there in bed? How are you? And what do you expect him to say? You expect him to tell you that they're suffering a little bit, but you don't want to hear them take on too much. You don't want to hear excessive suffering. You just want the person to play along. Yes, I'm feeling bad, or I'm whatever the problem is. You want them to be incapacitated. You want them to feel that they really can't do anything, and to play a role. I recall a study on this quite a few years ago about what we do to people who go into hospitals. It used to be, for example, in the Veterans Administration Hospital. I interned there, and I used to see this so often. Making difference what happened. Somebody could come in with a broken finger or a nervous problem or whatever. First thing they did was to get them undressed and put them in a gray bathrobe. Took away all the authority. Most of you know what that is. Go down here to CVPH. Go in the emergency room, and if you're lucky, you may get to keep your clothes. Well, they turn it around, they're going to put that little short nightie on you that's open in the back, whatever it is. But anyway, role impairment. And you try to have authority, and you carry on your social competency wearing one of those things. It's kind of ridiculous. See, people expect us to play a certain role. Incapacity for a role, for example. A lot of people ask me about music. Okay, I have 3 sons who are pretty good at music. One of them is particularly good. I'm not at all. I couldn't be a musician, making a difference what I try to do. I have an incapacity. Some people can learn to do things if they don't know how, but they need a little talent. How about an inadequate role perception? Too many parents today, in my opinion, haven't a clear idea what they're supposed to be as a parent. They don't know how they're supposed to act. They don't know what's going on here. So an inadequate perception of what a role is. Oftentimes ask people before they marry, what is it you expect? What are you really doing? When you ask her to be your wife, what do you have in mind? What's the job you expect her to do? When you said yes, you'd be the wife, or you want to be the husband, what was the job? Some people simply reject a role. They really know what they're supposed to do, but they abandon it, reject it out of hand. They choose not to do something because of whatever reason. There are people who simply aren't prepared, inadequate preparation, don't have the resources. Sometimes problems arise through no fault of the person. I mentioned that to start with. Inter-role conflict. There can be inter-role, that is, I'm supposed to do this and I'm also supposed to do this. I have two different roles to play at the same time. Then there can be intra-role conflict. In other words, within myself, I'm expected to do things which are in conflict. Now, the two different things like inter-role, for example, can you be a full-time mother and a home provider for the family at the same time? Two different roles. In other words, your job may require you to do something else. But maybe the homemaker role would say you're going to be at home and you're going to do the best for the children. The intra-role conflict, for example, any of us parents have had this happen to us. How much do we care about our children? How much do we love a child? Do we love the child enough to be a good disciplinarian? Too many families, they experience that kind of conflict and they won't discipline the children because they have the impression that discipline means they don't love the child. There's a thing called interpositions in roles. Where one role overlaps another one. For example, I've seen this oftentimes. Boy, any of you, I mentioned the hospital a while ago. You go to the hospital and you're aching or you're bleeding, you have something broken, and what happens? There's an insurance clerk there sort of interfering with what you thought you needed to be doing. Well, the insurance clerk is supposed to do a job, and here come the nurses, the triage people. They're supposed to be doing a job. And you see it on an ambulance call. I've seen it often. A motor vehicle accident. Police are there. They have a specific job. EMT is there, has a specific job. Sometimes one is waiting for the other. Both jobs are important. Both have to be done. But it's a problem of roles. Sometimes people have a hard time separating roles, don't they? They don't turn it loose. They don't feel like they can. For example, somebody who's a teacher may come home and treat his or her own children like students in school, in the classroom. Doesn't turn loose the role. Somebody who's a correction officer comes home and treats the children like inmates. Doesn't turn loose the role. Doesn't shift gears. We have a lot of those things. I hear oftentimes a wife would say he treats me like he thinks I'm his mother. Separating that sort of problem. Or he wants me to be his mother. Sometimes that's it. There are things that are roles that are incompatible. Things that they don't go together. For example, you can't be a mother and a virgin at the same time. There's only one who made that. The rest of the people can't do it. You can't have a parent and a single life at the same time. And sometimes problems arise in roles that are outside of the attempts of the person's own ability. For example, a situational crisis. People who are expected to do certain things because of a situation. We have a role expansion there. Sometimes we have to become better than we are, better than we thought we could be. Problems within the person trying to do that. How do you really meet the demands of a crisis situation? Well, by preparation and training, usually. And if we haven't had that preparation and training, then we can be expected to suffer some stress. Sometimes people are overly motivated or internalize their roles. They're frustrated, they're disappointed, they're afraid for whatever reason. It usually shows. Sometimes there's just plain old confusion. A person may be quite intelligent, quite capable to carry out, but doesn't know. there hasn't been sufficient information given to know what role is supposed to be played. Then all of us have done this. We try to take on something new and we can't do it. We feel uncomfortable about carrying out a certain role. So what do? We go back to a role we're comfortable with. Retrogression. We regress. We take up something we already know how to do. Then there are things called role reversals. We see that a lot, don't we? Once you stop to think about it, you've seen it. You've seen when the leader doesn't lead, the people who are supposed to be led turn out to be the leaders. Role reversals. Where the students run a classroom rather than the teacher. Where the children take care of the parents rather than the parents taking care of the children. Every now and then I see children who are being put in a job of running the families. Role reversal. It's kind of stressful for them. Also, we have role shock. Role shock goes along sometime when people have been placed in a situation that demands more of them than they can give. And we see the aftermath sometimes of that is post-traumatic shock disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder. We see people who are really puzzled and troubled by that. And then we see roles that are just really a real problem. Criminal roles, illicit roles, anomalous roles. We see situations come up where people will be in a role that is, they are carrying out a certain kind of behavior that's troublesome to others, may be stigmatized, their behavior may be bizarre. And speaking of behavior, there is such a thing called a roleless role. Now, some of you perhaps think that's a strange combination, roleless role. In other words, you take a person who has a place in society, a position, and yet there's no expected behavior associated with it. What's a person supposed to do? For a long time, the elderly, the retired person, was called a person in a roleless role. What are you supposed to do when you retire? How are you supposed to act? Sometimes society doesn't structure itself enough so that even young people know what to do or what's expected. It's a situation called anomie, A-N-O-M-I-E, and a valuelessness, a rolelessness, and it's a very dangerous situation. There are behaviors that some people get into that are simply anomalous. That is, what they're doing is something that doesn't belong anywhere particularly. Doesn't mean it's illegal. It's just unexpected. Then there are illicit roles. Roles that are not necessarily illegal. For example, a homeless person. A homeless person most of the time is not doing something illegal. It's just illicit. It's not according to the social norm, social standards. Then there are roles that people do that are called deviant, where the behavior, they're doing something that's specifically not approved. It's not accepted by the greater society. The offender role, the person who does things illegal, criminal. We call them inmates most of the time, don't we? Or felons. We label people who typically play the offender role. But I was talking earlier one time about crimes and juvenile delinquency, and some people do that. Criminal by definition. Then there are stigmatized and ritualized roles. People who will carry out certain behaviors that have meaning to them but not necessarily any meaning to other people. Okay, the role relevance here, back to that in the families. We're not being fair to children if we don't teach them what they're expected to do, what behavior we expect. All of you with an employment record can feel comfortable that you were doing what the boss, the supervisor, the owner, the manager, or whatever the title was, wanted you to do. And maybe you became that person in time by doing what was expected. In a sense, a job description. Okay, we have that in the families. We have jobs to do in the family, and we should be willing and be prepared to carry out those. How can children learn what to do if the parents don't show them? If the parents don't set an example of what a mother or father is supposed to do, where's the child supposed to learn it? And too many of them are put in a position where they don't know. Why? Because the parents didn't know. And I also recommend to people, why not review your roles with each other? Sometimes a husband and wife, they had a good agreement, they had a good marriage to start with, and they were functioning in ways that was acceptable and agreeable and compatible, complementary to each other. And several years later, they don't have the same feeling. And they sometimes come around and say, why? What's going out? The light, the flame has gone out of our relationship. Why not review what you're doing and how you're doing it? You may find that you're continuing to do a lot of things that's no longer meaningful. Maybe you need to switch and do something else. Maybe the expectations have changed. Why not? Why not look at it again? It'll pay you well. Review the roles that you're expected to do. Do it periodically. And what would you like for me to do? How would you like for me to express myself in a way that's comfortable and beneficial to you? Who knows? You might have that master's touch in helping somebody become better than he or she would be without you. Well, until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton, and this is Family Life in the North Country. Recently had an interesting question. It said that I had told a story about the master's touch, but somebody said it wasn't understood how I said it. So I thought, well, I'll say it again about this little story about the master's touch. Well, an old fiddle was found in an attic and was put up for auction. And the auctioneer, picked up the old fiddle and said, what am I bid for this old fiddle? And it was dusty. Didn't look like anything. Somebody said $5. Somebody else said $5.50. And the auctioneer just decided to pull it back and put it down. And a little while later, an old man came along and picked up the old fiddle and dusted it off, tuned it. And he started playing. He played a beautiful song. Excuse me. The people there at the auction were very impressed. And then the old man played several more beautiful songs. So the auctioneer came back and picked up this fiddle and said, what am I offered for this violin? Somebody said $1,000. Somebody said $1,500. Well, that's the story. The master's touch. And the whole point that I had told before was that any one of us can have the master's touch. What we do when we pick up somebody, when we touch somebody, when we dust off somebody, and try to set them on the right road, we can have people become better than they thought they could be. We can help people become even better than they ever thought of themselves. And sometimes it's our expectation that does the difference. And the interesting thing about this is that you don't have to be a professional or educated or an ordained person like a preacher, minister, priest, rabbi. Anybody can have the master's touch if you just take the time to try to help somebody else. Take the time to really see the value that's within the person, like that old fiddle. See, the old man with a master's touch could look at that and knew what its potential was. That's the story. Hope that satisfied the person who wanted to really understand what it was about. Okay, here's a question that came in. I've had several people ask me this question over time. It says, Dr. Middleton, I'm not a trained or educated person. Do you think I should be trusted to teach my children? Usually this sort of question comes along in the same way. The person who questions has just enough education to question. You know, sometimes a little something is worse than none at all. Well, my answer is, of course you can teach your child. Try to put it around the other way. How can you not teach your child? What can you possibly do that won't teach your child something, whatever you do? So you can't avoid teaching, so you might as well accept it. Think about what the child has already learned. Now, is the child going in the direction you want it to? Are things going the way you want it to? What's going on about the education? Well, any parent can teach a child. You know, a lot of people, like last question, a lot of people get caught up with what parents can do or don't do about sex education. Sex education is today a rather confusing pattern. Rather confusing because it seems like the professionals have caused us to question a great deal. We see this sort of thing in schools. School teachers are trying to follow a state curriculum or syllabus. And I think the teachers would probably do a better job in sex education if they didn't have the state guidelines. Because parents are the natural teachers. You think about it. By the time the child starts to school, the child has already learned a great deal. In fact, before the child even gets home from the hospital, usually it's already been exposed to gender differences. And if you've ever watched new fathers at a nursery, newborn nursery, some of them go up there with footballs and all that sort of thing. They're going to really impress their new sons. Well, I've been down that road, to walk the walk, talk the talk, so to speak, and I don't fault them. That's not wrong. Now some people think, oh, that's wrong. There's nothing wrong about that. Parents are the natural caretakers. Parents need to feel whatever they're doing is going to be teaching. So, what do they want the kids to know? There's several things they need to know. They need to know gender identity. That's important. A child needs to know, is it a boy or a girl? It's going to be treated that way. It's going to grow up in a world that only has two genders. You know, the parents always come in different genders. Grandparents come in different genders. That's just the way the world is. Too many people have questions and serious conflicts about things like that these days. There's another important element that people need to teach about sex education. That is that sexual curiosity is healthy. There's not anything wrong with having sex drives or sexual curiosity. It's perfectly healthy. Now, what we have to learn and what we have to teach is that some behavior is responsible and some isn't. That there are limitations. One person's freedom stops where the next person's restrictions begin. You've known that all your life. For every problem and for every right, there are responsibilities. This is what we need to teach about sex education. That there are responsibilities. And just because someone has the ability to perform doesn't necessarily give them the right to do so. That's simple. Every society and every religion throughout the world has set limitations, has guidelines or has restrictions, has codes of conduct, rites of passage, things that people have to do in order to attain a certain level. Most people find the greatest happiness in marriage. marriage in which, of course, their sexual expression is encouraged. The place to do it. This is the way it is all over the world. Most societies incorporate sexual fidelity and chastity in their norms. In other words, a person is supposed to live a good life according to the norms of that society. And that could be what would be considered to be a good life. Now, some of the norms are not at all what we have in this country. But basically what we have is saying that people should be faithful to one another once they marry, sexual fidelity, and basically most people are of the idea and opinion that people should live a pure life before they marry, recognizing certainly that not everybody does that, but that doesn't take away the norm that people want to teach. All of this reminds me of the question about the young teenager who asked her mother, said, what should she wear when she's going to go have sex? Some of you may have heard the answer, but the mother said, a wedding dress and a wedding ring on your third finger left hand. That's a pretty good answer, isn't it? And that expresses what a lot of people feel. Here's a question to get off the subject of sex education. I've had two questions like this lately. A woman called and said, I'm married to a man who doesn't like to bathe. What can I do? Well, husbands and wives owe it to each other to appear and maintain their looks and their hygiene in the best possible way. When you really care about someone, you'll do that. You'll take care of yourself. You'll take care of your own body. But there are some people indeed who don't want to do that. I recall one time, I thought her a very attractive young lady. She was a new bride. And she complained to me that her husband had quit shaving and quit wearing clean clothes right after they married. And she was troubled and she was crying, excuse me, because she thought she had done something wrong or was doing something wrong. I remember thinking, I don't understand this. Somebody as attractive as this girl, and she was unusually attractive. What's going on with this guy? So I asked him. And he had a rather strange answer. He said, why keep old dead bait around after you've caught the fish? Now, that was his answer. He'd also sold a red convertible that he had, that they'd gone around in their courting days. And he was really serious. Once he had caught her and she had married him, he didn't think he owed her anything. He didn't think he had any reason to look nice, to dress nice. Before they married, he made a very real point of doing so. And it was interesting. You know, sometimes husbands and wives are very unthoughtful. And then think about it. I like that man. It turned out he didn't really want to run his wife off. He cared about her. But somewhere in his background, he had the idea that it wasn't important after you marry. I had a woman ask me one time a rather interesting question. She said, have you ever kissed an ashtray full of old cigar butts full of stale beer? She said, that's the way my husband comes to bed. Well, my answer was no. I've never done that. And I hope I never have to. But that's an example of how some men are so terribly unthoughtful. I don't believe I ever met the man that she was describing. In other words, a woman came to see me about the marriage problem. But I've often wondered about that. And I watch people, listen to people. But an old ashtray full of old cigar butts full of stale beer is kind of awesome. Had another question recently that a woman called me, and from out of state. Started off saying, what about May and December weddings and marriages? Well, what about them? I didn't know the question. She's talking about, she's 39, her husband's 71. Well, age differences, and age alone is not the problem. They have a 1-year-old child. I say that because really was out of state. Nobody could possibly know who I was talking about. You don't even know what state it was. It wasn't even an adjoining state. A 1-year-old child and a 3-year-old child. She's very concerned about age. If that was a problem. Well, age does not in itself make a problem. You know, it used to be that for a man to ask a woman to be his wife, he was expected to have already finished his education. And education in the old days meant learn how to do a job, finished enough of learning how to work to be able to support his wife fully, 100%. And none of this 50-50 stuff. If a man couldn't support his wife, he wouldn't ask a woman to marry him. Now, that meant that most men were indeed older than their wives. They had to be. But since that's the way everybody did it, basically, older men married younger women. The older man could support the family. That was expected. The patterns are very simple, very clear. 50-50 weddings today, I see them all the time. People are expecting each other to earn 50% of the money, to earn 50% of the income. I like it the other way. I like it when any man is willing and able to be 100% responsible. I think that's what works best. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Today we're going to start off with something that seems to be happening pretty commonly around the country, not just in the North Country, but all over. A man I know, and this has come to me from several directions, has left his family saying he doesn't love his wife now and needs some time alone. And my question was given to me was, what do I think about that? Well, I hear this more and more in either husband or wife. I hear them say, I need time alone. And so often the person would say, well, it's not something you've done. It's just that I need time alone. Well, I'm opposed to either husband or wife checking out that way. Fact is, they usually are not alone when they check out. They're going to meet somebody else, or basically, even if they don't intend to start with, it's usually not very long before somebody comes knocking on the door. I don't know of anyone who ever constantly loved his or her spouse 100% all of the time. I don't know that happening. Feelings wax and wane. They grow and they shrink. I guess the media portrays it that people are always loving at a very high, constant level. The facts are that most people in the world and throughout history haven't married for love. They marry for duty, for responsibility, and happiness and love really follows afterwards for most people. In some societies, a husband and wife may never have even met each other before the wedding ceremony. How do these people get along? What happens to those marriages? And surprisingly, to people in this society, most of them get along very well. I have a real problem with accepting the idea that a mother or father can just walk out on a family because I don't love you right now. Where do they learn that? It's sort of like time out in school, or it's kind of like, I recall playing games as a youngster, playing tag or playing catch or something, where the person who's chasing you, if you call time out, and for some reason, I don't know why, where I grew up, we would say King's X. I don't know what it referred to, but King's X meant everything's suspended, everybody stopped. Or if you said time out, that meant if you got a sticker in your foot or you fell down or something that wasn't part of the game happened, not your fault. Well, the game stopped until you were ready to play again. And probably most people play games like that. Well, this is the way some people are playing marriage. It doesn't make sense to me. See, people can say, hey, time out. I feel a little stressed right now. I need time alone. Well, what are you supposed to do? Put the kids back in the toy box until you feel all right? They don't work that way. Children have a habit of getting hungry at certain times. They need care. They need sleep. They need protection. They need to be provided for. I don't know of any family where you can just say time out and everything is suspended. That's kind of like some mystical thing on television that you watch some surrealistic science fiction program. No, families aren't based that way. I don't know of anybody who can logically expect children to just suspend their needs until mommy or daddy feels okay again. But I see it happening. I see it, and it's all around me. People are frankly just abandoning their families. They're abandoning their promises. And what about the spouse? Some of these families I get to know them, some of them very well. Maybe the woman gave up her intended career. Maybe she gave up college. Maybe she put her ambition on hold in order to marry this guy. And they start a family. And a little while later, maybe 1, 2, 3 children later, he says, time out. She interrupted her career. She moved to where he wanted to move. They established a family where he wanted to establish it. And I say he, excuse me, both of them, of course. They were part of it. But then, all of a sudden, unilaterally, he backs out. Says, time out. Sorry. I've seen this over and over again. More often the men do this and just walk away and leave the woman to take care of the children. I remember one woman whose husband did that in a little place near here, and we talked about it a while. And this man kept coming back and saying he wanted to be fair. So she and I sort of formulated a plan. They had 8 children. She said, okay, I'll be fair. You've been gone a week. I'm leaving for a week. You take care of the 8 children. How long do you think it took that man to come to his senses? Him at home with 8 children. It didn't take very long. He was hollering and screaming and begging and pleading. He wanted his wife back. He found out when she said time out, the same way he did, it wasn't the same picture at all. Okay. That's, I think, one way to approach it. I'm not recommending that anybody walk away from the family. I really don't. I think that's criminal. I think it should be punished severely. But I think if a man thinks he can just walk out and leave the woman, he ought to think about it the other way. Suppose she just walked out and left him. Well, I've heard him, just like that man I talked about, the father of those 8 children. By the way, I've seen those children. They turned out to be pretty good. That man and woman got back together and they decided that they had a whole lot to work for with each other. He had a job and he screamed that he couldn't earn the money, he couldn't support the family. How could he do this? Same thing applied to her. I think the husband or wife, the father or mother who just walks out and for punishments. Well, here's another one. Speaking of walking out, I didn't think it followed exactly, but here's a question that came in. Said, Dr. Middleton, my husband and I have reconciled after he'd had an affair, but we're walking on eggshells. We're tiptoeing around. We're not sure how to handle it, what to do. We're so afraid something's going to go wrong. I have a formula that I suggest that people use in these circumstances, and it seems to work. Now, one of the ingredients of my formula is if you really are deciding to get back together, first forgive. I'm not talking about forgetting, I'm talking about forgiving, a little 7-letter word. If you are confident the person doesn't intend to repeat the behavior, forgive. Then once forgiven, you don't have a right to bring it up again. You can't say, oh, you know this, you know that, back there, when all this. No. If you forgive something, it's forever. Another thing is to find a new dimension in your life. Find something that both the husband and wife are interested in. Find something that you enjoy doing, and hopefully something new that you haven't done before. And do it together. Focus on something new and separate from the affair that occurred. Basically make the marriage better than it ever was, not try to put it back like it was. And review the marriage contract. What is it that you really expect? What is it that you don't want? What is it that you're willing to accept? Talk about these things. Bring them out into the open. Talk about them honestly. And if you follow those guidelines, you should have a good time. Should enjoy reconciling and becoming really what you probably had in mind to start with. To have a perfect marriage. Well, we'll have perfect marriages just as soon as we have perfect people. But in the meantime, you can work on it. Here's a question that comes in, also pretty common these days. It says, Dr. Middleton, my family is strange. You see how strange you think it is. It said, my father says my boyfriend and I are not invited to their home as a couple, but either one of us is welcome. He says it's his religion. Can you help? And she added, oh yes, my boyfriend and I are sharing an apartment. Pretty common, isn't it? You hear about it all around you. the non-marital cohabitation. Used to call it shacking up. Okay, it's against the father's religion. It's against his belief system. Is he doing anything wrong? No. Is he being consistent? Yes. For him to invite you as a couple means that he would be accepting a relationship that in his opinion is wrong. Not whether or not you made a good choice, but wrong according to his beliefs. That's his belief. What are your beliefs? What are you telling your father? Are you telling your father, well, I don't care what you believe in. I'll make up the rules the way I want to live life, and I don't care what you believe about life in your home. I'm going to come to visit your home, and you're going to follow my rules. That's what you're telling your father. If you don't believe it, think about it a little bit longer. I find that this happens with increasing frequency. The parents get caught in the middle. They don't know what to do. A number of them have called in the past and said, I just had a phone call from daughter or son away at college, planning to come home this weekend, and they said, oh yes, and I'm bringing my boyfriend, girlfriend, but don't worry about it, we'll share the same bedroom. And the parent says, what am I supposed to do? I said, well, is it your house? Is it your home? That act like it. Was this the way you reared the family? They usually come back and say, no, that kind of person wouldn't have called me in the first place. Well, then act like it's your home. Act like it's your family. And if that's against your family rules, say so. Say in this house, that's not accepted. I even had somebody lately in a situation like this, excuse me, whose child was in the same situation, basically. Said, but doesn't the good book say to love the sinner and hate the sin? And aren't we supposed to be accepting? And this person said, what, didn't even Jesus get fussed at for having dinner with the sinners? So why can't we have dinner with our children? We don't want to tell the child we don't love them. Yes, same thing. I think the first one where the father said, either one of you are invited, he's telling the daughter in that case, I love you, I accept you. I don't like what you do, but don't expect me to accept the relationship that's not fair. It's not reasonable or according to his belief system. It's not moral, it's not right. Same thing applies to the homosexual relationships. It applies straight across the board. And I think more parents need to do that. Come to grips with what they're really talking about. Sometimes it takes a little courage to be a parent. Nobody ever said it'd be easy. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Starting off today, I have a series of questions that have come in, and I've tried to lump them together basically, but it starts off, is there any evidence that people who are homosexual can ever change? And the answer quite clearly is yes. I've read recently that there are over 200 publications, and I have several, showing that yes, indeed, homosexuals can change. That doesn't mean that everybody wants to. Some people, of course, don't want to change, but the gay and lesbian rights groups are putting out a lot of propaganda saying that anybody who's homosexual can't change. Well, that's just not true. In fact, one book on therapy says that there is no reason to believe that a person can't change that behavior in the same way that any other behavior can't be changed, with the same level of expectation. I read that recently. In other words, any therapy for any condition, the changing of homosexuality, whether or not you consider it a condition or an illness, that's your own viewpoint, that to change, if a person wants to change, has as good a chance of changing as recovering from anything else. Now, a lot of parents are caught up in trying to figure out, what did I do wrong? What did we do wrong? I've had clients come and cry on my shoulder, very upset that a child had called or come in and said something like, I'm gay, a famous word these days, and the parents become very distressed. Well, it doesn't mean that the parents did anything wrong. That's not what happened. You can usually find a pattern of behavior in the family, but that doesn't mean that the parents willfully did anything wrong. Just because people have patterns doesn't mean something happened. What are the problems? Well, sometimes it's, for example, with the males, the mother oftentimes is negative about the father. She forms a very close relationship with the son, typically. That's pretty common. The father is looked on as either a tyrant or a weak person, and being a man is not considered to be the best thing to do. Well, does that mean that the mother planned it that way? Of course not. How about the fathers? The fathers who aren't around, the fathers who aren't close, don't feel warm, are, for whatever reason, distant from the children. You get into all sorts of patterns. It doesn't mean that the parents have done anything wrong. Then you also have a lot of young adolescents have feelings about homosexuality. You know what happens to most of them? They outgrow it. It's not a problem. It's just a time. And the best literature today, from psychoanalytic literature and others, is that perhaps what we're really looking at is a delayed development. That homosexual behavior is not a full development into maturity. And this is basically what happens in therapy and treatment for people who come along and say, I am this and I want to change. So what we usually try to do is to help the person come to grips with it and learn how to be mature. And indeed, most of them can change if they want to. Here's another question that comes in. Talking about, you may not want to comment on television, but I've watched a generation of kids grow up and they've had the same basic values taught to them, and yet they don't seem to act like it. What's wrong? Well, I've watched that too. I've watched a couple of generations now. You know, generation's considered to be 30 years. Okay, I've watched more than two. Here's what we have. We have several things. We have young people today who are in school, and schools make a very real effort to be value-free, not to teach particular values. We have a media that has really capitalized on attracting people's attention by eroticizing, by putting a lot of focus on sexual behavior, and putting a lot of focus on tearing down values. Iconoclastic is a fancy word, but it means attacking the values of the belief systems, the substance of a society. We also have soap operas that are basically what would have been considered not long ago X-rated, and they get by with calling themselves soap operas. And indeed, they're selling soap or something. But they're also selling a great deal of misbehavior. The schools that try to be value-free and the government trying to be value-free, rather strange. They're trying to be value-free so they won't insult that toad over there who's a non-believer in anything. He doesn't care one way or the other. And he doesn't respect the people who try to respect his differences. And fewer parents are trying to teach their children values. They may believe very strongly in values themselves, but how much time do they take? Take a typical household. Mother gets up, runs through breakfast, gets the kids ready for school, goes to work, comes home, rushes through, she's getting supper, dinner ready, gets things going, little clean up, little homework, pats kids on the head and they go to bed. Then she collapses for a little peace and quiet for herself. There's been very little talk about values. There's been very little evidence shared. How about the fathers? The fathers aren't picking up the slack. They're not teaching the children the values. Their father may be sitting watching television while mother is busy in the kitchen. And father's been off working. Maybe he has 2 jobs, that sort of thing. But even sitting watching television, their typical parents are not using what they see as a teaching device. They're not teaching children. See what this is on television and explaining the value systems that are involved. So what we have is fewer and fewer parents are taking the time, or indeed have the time. Is that fair to say, have the time? I'm always reluctant to say I don't have time for something, because in truth I have as much time as anybody else. Do you know anybody who has less time or more time than anybody else? It's not whether or not we have time, it's what we do with it, isn't it? It's how we use the time. This is what we see. I've watched and talked to a number of fathers who had 2 jobs, 3 jobs even sometimes. I remember a man one time had 3 jobs, and I asked him, why are you doing this? Why are you working so hard? He wasn't coming to see me because he had problems. I was watching him work and just talking to him. He said, well, I'm doing this for my family. I said, when do you see your family? This man had 3 jobs. He couldn't answer. He only basically saw his family in passing. Well, somebody was going out the door. Either he was, or somebody in the family, or all of them. But he really wasn't spending time. A few years later, I remembered that man very much so, and talked quite at length to one of his daughters. She was saying, our father never spent any time with us. He was always working. And he's always working, saying it was for the family, but we didn't get to know him. And fathers, surprisingly, to some people it's surprising, have a very definite, important role. And it's not so much what they make, the money. They have a role because men are different from women. And it's been found over and over again that when both parents are in the home, the children do better. It's been found because people started looking for research answers. It's been known for several centuries. It's not anything new. When people stop to think about it, they usually come to that conclusion. Yes, children do better when they have both parents in the home, when they have a family to relate to. I think we're putting far too much emphasis on materialism. To buy toys. You see these bumper stickers, the one who has the most toys when he dies wins, things like that. We have a lot of toys around a lot of houses. And that's what people are working for. They're working for the extras. Extra what? Toys. toys, most of the toys don't make any sense if you take it out of the context of certain particular pattern. Do you know what I'm saying? Well, I'm saying that unless you watch programs or know the themes and know whatever is supposed to be going on about some of the toys that are being produced, they don't make much sense to you. Well, how much time do people spend teaching religion? Somebody asked me, am I a preacher or a teacher? I had somebody write to me from just across the lake over here, apparently watching one of the programs. So what church do you belong to? No, I'm not a preacher, minister. Never have been. I make an effort to teach religion. I still teach senior high school students, try to teach religion. I also started a course one time, a graduate course, called Counseling and Spirituality. It was a very difficult course to get approved to be taught at State University because they kept saying, some of the faculty, we don't want anything like that taught at the university. They didn't think anything at all wrong with teaching a course that attacked religion, but they didn't want a course that used religious ideas. And the reason I started that course, maybe I'll write a book about it one of these days, because most counselors, most psychotherapists, most psychiatrists, most social workers have had no training whatever in how to work with people who have problems about religion. And religion is a very important part of society. I think all of us would agree to that. But the therapists, the counselors, the people who are supposed to know most about how to help people with problems, most of the time that subject isn't even mentioned in the graduate schools, except to put it down. Now the humanists like to put it down. They like to say, well, the quicker we get people over the religious hang-ups, the better they'll be. That's a clear statement, and when I said that, I'm quoting Carl Rogers. That's what he said. I have it on recording. Carl Rogers, even though he's trained for the ministry in his young adulthood, turned very much against it later. Which comes up with another question. Somebody asked me, have I ever heard of a really bad boy or girl turning out to be good? Yes, I have. I've seen both male and females who were really bad characters turn out to be good, convert their life to something positive. Usually it's in reference to religion, but it doesn't have to be. I've seen people who turned the page or opened a new chapter in their book of their life without religion, but most of the time it's in reference to religion. When I answered that question the other day for somebody, it was turned around. Have I ever seen people who were really good people turn around and become bad? Yes, I certainly have. And sometimes these parents who walk out on their families, that's the beginning of it. But I've seen people who were living very dedicated, devoted, wholesome lives, yes, living with perhaps in the family, turn around and become very bad. Now, why? First thing I look for, if this happens suddenly, is the person taking the drug? Is this a product of drug? Or is something tragic, very traumatizing, disturbing happening in that person's life? If people start questioning the why of their life, they usually have trouble figuring out how to live. It's very important, these sudden turnarounds. Drugs can include alcoholism, of course. People who suddenly turn things around seem to, maybe the problem was generating, festering, so to speak, and all of a sudden it starts being shown. But usually there's something dramatic that's happening in the way the person feels or believes about himself or herself. Yes, I certainly have seen both ways. People who were apparently very little good could be said about them turn around and become very good people. I've seen quite the other people who were upright, upstanding citizens, leaders in their church, their community, their work, turn around and become very sad situations. The belief system. Something has to happen to cause a person to drop a belief system, to start wondering and questioning, why do we do certain things? And usually the help of the person is to help that person find out the why. To do religious counseling, if you will, because so often it's involved with religion. That's the way it is. And by the way, that reminds me of something I read lately that said, the greatest accomplishment the devil has ever done was to convince people he doesn't exist. That's influenced more lives than anything else. I've forgotten where I read that. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life of the North Country.